back, and there was a sign on the door said quarantined. And from Moulton, I didn't know what that meant, so I just waited there. My mom came out and told me I need to put on some gloves and some booties and a mask to go see my dad. And walked in, and anyway, I saw him, and they said, "We think it's leukemia," is what they told me at the time. Well, my mother wasn't going to leave his side, so I had to go back to Moulton to get my brother to bring him back. It's easy for us in church to say pray. It's easy for us in church to say, let's study harder, let's learn about God. And when I saw my 16-year-old brother, and I told him that Dad was sick, and the real world came out, and he said, "Why does this always have to happen to us?" I didn't know what to tell him. I was asking the same questions, I just didn't ask it out loud. Sometimes when bad things happen, we got to ask why. We're so good. We go to church every Sunday. We go to church every Wednesday. But it's still, why is this happening to us? It's an easy question for us to answer. Why? I'm reading a book of Ecclesiastes. I'm reading a lot of commentary about Ecclesiastes, and I read one. It's called A Life Well Lived. It's by a gentleman named Tommy Nelson out in Texas. And he poses this question. He says, is Satan easier for us to understand than God? Is it easier for us to understand Satan than it is for God? And his point was, because Satan is pure evil, and he's trying to make bad things happen, it's sometimes easier for us to understand the work that Satan is doing. But it's hard for us sometimes to understand the work that God is doing in our lives when we're going through trials. Because does God give us an answer of why we're going through those trials? He really doesn't. We can ask why all the time, but it's just not there. So Solomon gets into this a little bit in chapter 3. And I'll start reading in verse 1. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. We all go through these seasons in life. What I think is very interesting is after Solomon's just made this revelation that there is a better life out there than what you're experiencing, and that's a life with God. And then he says, but in everything there's a season, a time for every matter. God has a plan, and God doesn't waver from those plans very often. And we'll see throughout, I think, this study that the sovereignty of God, His sovereignty exists in everything. And that's hard for us sometimes to kind of grasp. But let's continue reading in verse 2. There's a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear, a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. a time of war, and a time for peace. I think too often we look at God and we think of him sometimes as a genie, right? Genie in a bottle. And things aren't going our way, it's easy to pray and ask for correction to bring him back toward our will and where we want to go. But God isn't a genie in a bottle. Because we sometimes pray for things that we want, and those prayers are delayed or not answered in a timely manner, or maybe it's just a flat-out no sometimes. And so it's difficult for some that aren't in church to understand that. It's really difficult for some to, outside of these walls and this building and these meetings all throughout the world today, it's hard for them to grasp that. Because if we're being good, because that's what we were taught, right? When we're kids. If we're good, then good things are going to come in return. That was the invention of Santa Claus, right? When you're good, Santa's going to be good to you. Right? That was a way to keep kids in line. But things happen. And sometimes we just don't have an immediate answer for that. Then verse 9. What gain has the worker from his toil? We saw this all in chapter 1 and chapter 2. We do all this. We go through life. We see everything. We're chasing after things that we think are going to make us happy. And then life happens, both good and bad. There's a lot going on. So I'll just ask this, because again, there's a lot of experience, I think, a lot more than I've had. But why do we work so hard? Try to get ahead. We're trying to get ahead of something, right? Got to have enough so that we don't have to work hard later on in life, right? That's we get ahead so that we can kind of relax and coast for a little while, right? All right. I don't know who's going to answer this more. First, I want to hear from the men first, and then we'll hear from the ladies. I'll make them go first. Why do you want to get married? Nobody did. Okay. Okay. Malcolm, I know you're just sitting on your seat wanting to say something. I know, but don't get ahead of me, Lee. Don't bring your wisdom into this conversation. Why? Why do we get married? And then sometimes we get married. You found the one to spend the rest of your life with. That's right. That's a great answer. It's a great answer. Say, raise a family. Yeah. We want to get married for that. Those are great. Those are great. Ladies, what about you? Why do you want to get married? Again, nobody, they're like, I don't know. Lee said security. Okay. Well, I noticed you didn't say security. So that obviously wasn't part of your parameter. Like, hey, these are going to be some great lunch discussions, I can tell already, of why. Why it's hard to verbalize, to articulate really why we get married. But this is what I know, and I'm glad she's in class today. I'm glad she's here today. Usually she tries to avoid my class when all possible because she never knows what I might say. But Paige is here today, so I have to be very, very careful with what I say, so that my lunch discussion is not too off the wall. But no, I found the woman that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with as well. It was what I wanted. Now, fast forward 6 months in that relationship, and is this really what I wanted? Is this what I wanted? When she lets me know very sternly that the toilet seat is not to be left down or left up after I use the restroom. She had fallen in too many times in the middle of the night, and that wasn't good. And some trials and tribulations and things that her family did that my family didn't, and we're trying to learn how to communicate, and we're trying to learn each other, and it was really, really difficult. There were good times and there were bad times, but we got through it. We wanted to get married, and one of the things that we said in our first year of marriage, even through our engagement, that divorce will not be in our vocabulary, that is not an option at all. When we set our vows, this is what will happen, which meant that I had to change my standards and live somewhere else. And she, to some degree, needed to change her standards, really to understand me, and how I worked. She did a lot more. She was a lot more flexible than I was, so she deserves a lot more of the credit through all that. But life is the same way. We get thrown good things and bad things. So then we find out why we get married. Ed, you said we want to raise a family. Why do we want to have children? You are, aren't you? Yeah, it is. So you can have grandchildren. We'll go through this small season so that we can have those grandchildren later on, right? Because our children bring us some great joy when they're born, when they're young, throughout their lives. But they can bring a lot of heartache too, can't they? Can bring a lot of things that we as parents don't agree with, not the way that we raised them. Solomon's playing kind of the devil's advocate when he's reading through these verses. We see there's what gain is the worker from his toil? Well, he asks the question, and we know why we do these things, but then we find out life is really, really hard. Then he says this, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man. This is verse 10, to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. When you do have children, and they're learning about the world and life the first time, what is their favorite question to ask? Why? And so I'll ask a kid's question. Why do you think that is? They don't know. Mm-hmm. How does that evolve into today? 40 years down the road, 50 years down the road, 90 years down the road. Does that why question go away? I don't think it does it? We always want to know. Because he says, he has put eternity into man's heart. There's a bigger purpose than what you're seeing. And We're trying to ask why. Why are we, what is this all about? Why am I here? It just seems to be part of our human nature that he puts in there. Next couple of verses here, the author of this book, he says that Solomon goes on to explain this life with God. And he says, because of life with God and God's plan and God's sovereignty, he said there are kind of four pillars that we can kind of pull from this. The first one in verse 10 there, that God's plan is wise. I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He's made everything beautiful in its time, he says. God's plan is wise. Even bad things in our lives have a purpose. I saw my father through that situation. And that was just the diagnosis, because we had no idea what was to lie ahead. Many of you have met my father and know him. He made it through all the treatments that summer. It was a difficult summer. He's a big fella. I mean, I think the time of his diagnosis, he was about 310, I think, and I watched him go to about 140, 145. It was completely draining on him. But he got back up to about 290 now. He's good. He's healthy. Mom feeds him really well. He had a couple of things. But in that moment, I remember my father, when me and my brother got back, and he had these tubes coming out of his nose and everything going into his to a little catheter he had, and blood was being given to him. They were infusing with this blood. And to this point in my life, 20 years on the earth, I'd seen my father with a head cold and maybe a headache. That's about all I'd ever seen from him. And I'm seeing him in this state, and then he says, the good Lord is going to take care of us. Whatever happens, I'm at peace. And it was not until years later that I reflected back on that moment to realize the wisdom that he had and what he was experiencing at the time. That he didn't know what was in store, but he knew that God had a better plan, a bigger plan for that, and he did. One of my favorite groups that I listen to. My kids love it. I mean, they're all about. But anybody ever heard of the Fairfield Four? Nobody. Okay, this is good. They're based out of Nashville, and I'm big into Southern gospel. This is an a cappella group, and you'd think it's a quartet, but no, they're 5 guys in the Fairfield Four. It's really good. They've been around since the 1950s. They come to their concert. They wear overalls and a white shirt and a bow tie. And it's 5 black gentlemen, and they sing a cappella, and they sing some old kind of hymns, and then they sing some new things. And one of the cassette tapes that I had, in the middle of the track, one of the guy that was singing the lead starts saying a prayer. And he talks about guiding us around the dangerous streets of Nashville. But then he says, Father, thank you for the bad times we have. And he follows it up with, we need a little rain to appreciate the sunshine. And sometimes in our lives, that's what we need. We need a little rain to understand where God is. Has anybody ever seen The Truman Show? The movie The Truman Show? Two or three of us have. Well, it's a story. It was kind of just at the start of kind of reality TV, And the movie is about a man that they created a world, this bubble, and he lived in it. And they were trying to make everything in his life perfect. So he had the perfect wife, perfect family. He was born in this bubble, and the producer was trying to control everything in his life. If God had made everything perfect, there was no evil today, do you think we could understand the love that God had for us? Could we appreciate God as much if there were no evil? What do you think? I can't wait till we get to paradise, though, to see what it's like with that. But in our world today, sometimes we need those bad times to really understand how good it was. We think about the story of Joseph, and this past, I guess, our time in Nashville at Lads to Leaders, the whole theme was what you meant for evil, God meant for good. We think about the story of Joseph and all that he did in Genesis chapter 50, where he talks about that. Sometimes life doesn't make sense, but God, we know, is still in control. The other thing that we talked about, or that he says is a pillar of kind of God's sovereignty and plan, is that it's mysterious. God's mysterious. He never reveals to us really immediately what it is, and we keep that question of why on our hearts. Let's flip over real quick to Habakkuk. We're going to look at two other prophets, them asking questions. Habakkuk chapter 1. The title of this section in my ESV version is Habakkuk's Complaint. And in verse 4 he says this: "So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." Why do good things happen to bad people, and why do bad things happen to good people? In Jeremiah, he says something very, very similar. Jeremiah 15. We go down to verse 18. I'll read this for you. Jeremiah says this: "Why is my pain unceasing, my wound incurable, refusing to be healed? Will you be to me like the deceitful brook, like waters that fail?" Then the Lord goes on to answer him. We're built with this question of why, and God and his plan is mysterious. The way that he's set it up. We all really want to know God, but we can't. This third pillar that he talks about, this author specifically, is, let's go back to Ecclesiastes, and I'll read, starting verse 12 here. "I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil that is God's gift to man." His third pillar about God and his sovereignty is we've got to enjoy today. Right? With all that's going on in our life, with all that is happening to us, we've got to find a way to find joy in today. Because every day, is a gift from God. We don't know what tomorrow might bring. Matthew chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, the end, God says, or Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't be anxious about tomorrow. It'll take care of itself. But think about today. So there's a book that I read. I read a lot of books, but for my other job, and I think that there's more to life than just accumulating a lot of money and wealth and things like that. In this one book I read, he doesn't do financial planning. He does what he calls life planning. And he asks 3 questions. He tells advisors they should ask 3 questions to their folks. And the first one is what every advisor asks, when you turn age 65 and you want to retire, describe what that life looks like. Money's not an object. Just tell me what you want to do. And then we start making some notes about what all dreams and wishes and wants they have, and we put them down on paper. And then he says, well, then take it a step further and say, well, you go to your doctor and your doctor tells you you got 10 years to live. At the first question, money is not an object. It's just whatever you want to do. The second question puts a time limit and your resources today. Now he says, with what you have today, what would you like to do? So now we go from this big list of what we want to now a little bit smaller list. Okay, interesting. He said, for those that didn't hear that, he said, we spend a lifetime accumulating wealth, our health to get our wealth, and then we do our wealth to spend on our health, to get our health back. Yeah. Anyway, that's good. That's good. We'll get with you. I'll write that down. It sounds really, really good. But then he says there's one more question you got to ask, and the last question is probably the most crucial. And he says, so you go to the same doctor, you're at your meeting, but this time your doctor says you've got 24 hours to live. And it's not a bucket list, what are you going to do in the next 24 hours? But his question is this: what did you miss? If you find out today that you only had 24 hours left to live, what did you miss? And what's very interesting about that question is it usually isn't, I need to go jump out of an airplane, or I need to go climb Mount Kilimanjaro, or I need to go sail the ocean, whatever. It's usually something that they sacrificed, didn't give up, or a relationship that needs to be remended. And now we should spend our wealth and our resources trying to get that as opposed to the next big thing. But we've got to find joy in everything that we do. Because if that's what we're missing, then we need to go find joy in mending relationships, mending other things. And then the last point was that we can find rest in the sovereignty of God. Verse 14 and 15. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, and that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. God is in control. All these seasons of life, when you can understand that God is in control, even if it's not where we want to be, what we want to do, how we want our life to look, when we remember that God is in control of all that. Bad things happen, bad things will happen to us, and bad things happen for several reasons. Sometimes it's health, sometimes it's just pure evil that we can tell is directly from Satan himself, but everything is there. It's like the Anybody in here like jigsaw puzzles? Y'all like to do puzzles? Some, 2 people. That's good. I like to do them occasionally. But God in our life is a lot. He describes it this way, that it's like the centerpiece of the puzzle is put there. And then like nothing is happening around it, but then it all comes together at the end. It's not that they're just all kind of piecing together, but then we look back. I had one member at another church we used to attend. I remember him saying around his 75th birthday, he made this comment in class one time that it's amazing for me now to see. At the time I didn't understand, but 75 years looking backwards, to see that God has me right where He wants me. Because how all these twists and turns that He took all throughout His life got Him to where He is today. Solomon understands this. He put it in Ecclesiastes for us to know. And the last thing that I'll leave you with is God knows His perfect timing. It was the most amazing thing in the history of mankind. Was He knew beforehand that Adam and Eve were going to fail in the garden, that man was going to be corrupt, that evil was going to take over. And at His perfect timing, He sent His Son, Jesus. The most perfect person in the world, the one that never did anything wrong, and the most evil atrocity that we can imagine happened to Him. And God allowed that to happen, not for His Son, but for us. And that's just pretty amazing when we think about it. Anyway, that's all I have today. Hope you have a great Sunday and looking forward to worship and shine today. It's going to be fun.